Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you this rather autumnal morning, Ken?
Yep, it's coming towards the end of autumn here in the UK, in real time as we're recording this. I am well, thank you very much for asking, Rory. Hope you are well too, Rory. And I also hope that you are well listening to this. This is episode 173 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We've got an episode with 3 different sections for you today. We're going to be starting off with our student check-in. This is where we bring an element of what one might study in their along the road to becoming a counsellor or psychotherapist. But I think this applies to any counsellor at any level, because we're going to be speaking about configurations of self. It's an interesting theory, and I think I'm looking forward to digging into it. Then we go into Digital Counselling Revolution. That's where we recognise that technology is playing a part in how counselling is delivered and consumed. And today we're going to be speaking about sending and receiving contracts online. So if you're working online, you have a contract, how do you get approved consent that contract has been accepted? We're going to be looking at that. And then in Practice Matters, where we delve into private practice and what, well, not necessarily private practice, but professional practice, what we might come across during our practice. We have a guest, Michael Pearson, who is going to be speaking to us about sex and sexuality. He did a recent lecture in our CPD library. It's a really interesting topic, so looking forward to that one. But let's do that student check-in. Configurations of self, Rory.
Yes, the many voices inside the one, as they said from a Star Trek quote many years ago. But yes, it's really interesting. Traditional person-centered therapy thinking would say that we have a organismic self. We're a whole, and within that whole we become incongruent. And I used to use the graphic of 2 circles, rather like the Olympic rings, 2 of the Olympic rings, and they separated. And we were left with very little of ourselves and other people's interjected values. And as therapy progressed, those 2 circles would align again, and we would become our organismic self. And this has been the thinking on in person-centered therapy ever since really Rogers wrote the foundations of it. However, interestingly enough, a few years ago in the late 2000s, John Rowan. It was in 1990, John Rowan wrote a book called The Many Faces of Eve's Daughters and Sons, Subpersonalities. And it started a very, very strong debate within the person-centered community about, are we just one organismic self? Or are we many voices? So think about the times, if you're listening to this, when you've had very strong emotional feelings. It may be shame, it may be anger, it may be deep joy. And these could be considered subpersonalities, and they rattle around in us. We are kind of many little voices rattling around within the vessel of our mind, if you like. And sometimes when we go to therapy, it's one of those voices that's causing us the greatest difficulty. Now, when I use the term voices, I want to be really clear here. The voices I'm talking about are emotional feelings. They're not psychotic voices. They're a feeling. And how often, have I worked with clients and I've said, tell me a little more about this feeling of shame. What is this shame feeling? And the client has explored that subpersonality. And interestingly enough, when I started training, I was taught in the 2000s about the configurations of self. Configurations of self was generated by David Means. It was Means' kind of work, and he developed a new idea of person-centered therapy. So he took this idea of the many voices inside the one and developed it in a person-centered theme. Now, we're familiar with subpersonalities in at least one other set of theories. And that is, of course, TA, parents, adult and child, and their subconscious processes. The difference is that in person-centered therapy, we work with the here and now. And this is what Mearns was referring to. The fact that when a subpersonality arises in the therapy room, a feeling of shame, a feeling of fear, you address that particular aspect of the client's personality and work with it. And he talked about not for growth configurations. In other words, the configurations that hold us back, that give us difficulty, that give us pain in our lives. If a therapist works with those and addresses them and allows the client to engage with them, then maybe they can make sense of them, they can get past them, they can manage that side of them. And it is, for those who are doing maybe essays on the developments in person-centered therapy, a real solid development within the person-centered arena. And it's one of those developments you can actually use in your practice. If you're in your practice years, you can actually start by working with a client and the client says, I'm feeling really, really angry. And you can work with that angry part of them. Really useful piece of work. And when I taught it, every student said it just changed the way they practiced completely. It allowed them to really get closer to who the client is and the troubles that they have in their life.
Yeah, I love it. Configurations of self. It is also called dialogical self or dialogical theory. So that's another name that can be used interchangeably for this theory. And what we're looking at here is, as you've quite rightly said, Rory, we're not really hearing voices. It's the different parts that make us up, the different configurations that make up our self. And you may be able to relate to this if you're looking at this and going, oh, I don't quite get it. Then think about the last time that you judged yourself. Maybe when you did something and then afterwards you go, oh, I shouldn't have done that. And I did. Well, that is a configuration of self. It is, and you could identify it as being a judge. You could even dress it up and put it in a gown and give it a little gavel and say that is a judge. You might have a different part, a different configuration. And I'm using these as examples so you can kind of go, I get this, for that aha moment. That you find that your life's going along great, and then you maybe find that you keep on pushing the self-destruct button every now and again. Why do I do that? Why does when everything's going around, I always go and I push that self-destruct button and ruin it? Well, that's a configuration of self. And the whole self is made up of these different configurations. It's interesting to study as a theory. It's an interesting self-development exercise to look at your own configurations and work out who you are and what makes up you. There was a great film put out by, I think it was Pixar Disney. It was called Inside Out. And it showed all the different configurations that were driving this young girl, and anger would step in and he would take over the control panel, and then envy would step in and go over the control panel, and they had all these little parts that were played there. That was, I think, I enjoyed that as kind of a sketch of configurations of self. So looking at self, great self-development, but then also, as Rory, you've pointed out, it's interesting when working within the therapy relationship, if a client is bringing and they say, I really shouldn't have done that, and being really hard on themselves, then chances are at that moment you're speaking to the judge. You're speaking to the judge configuration of self, and you can work with that. It's an interesting theory and well worth digging into.
Yes, absolutely. And I came across it long before I was a therapist. I was listening to, I think it was someone on Radio 4 saying their husband was a psychotherapist and how much they love Star Trek. And they went on to explain that, for those who follow sci-fi and Star Trek, everybody's familiar with the Starship Enterprise and the characters on it. Well, you could think that the Enterprise itself was a person, and the configurations of self were the crew. And there were different people. There was the leader, there was the warrior, there was, in the later iterations of Star Trek, there was Data, the android, who wanted to become more human. How many times have we heard that in the therapy room? I want to become more of myself. I want to connect to more of myself. So it is a real good theory. It's a development of the person-centered theory, and it's one that can be developed and honed and used very successfully in practice.
Well, I'm happy to say that there is a super duper handout on configurations of self that accompanies this podcast that you can get. It's free of charge. You just go to our website, which is counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcasts tab. That's going to give you all our back catalogue of podcasts. The episode you're listening to right now is episode 173. So just scroll to episode 173, click on that episode, and right there you will find our show notes where we kind of go into more detail of what we've spoken about in the podcast. We put in links that are relevant to what we've spoken about, and you also get the free download from there. You can download that. It's a comprehensive document that really overviews configurations of self. Great if you're a student. You might be writing about this or asking to explain the latest developments in person-centered therapy. You want to have this on hand. Great if you're a qualified therapist and you want to work with configurations of self more in your therapy room. So Counselling Tutor is where to go for that one. So moving away from our student check-in into our Digital Counselling Revolution, where we're going to be talking about sending and receiving contracts when working online.
Digital Counselling Revolution.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? When I started counselling many years ago, a written contract was something that very, very few people had. And of course, through the years, the profession has become more professional. Clients have expected more, and written contracts are now the norm in therapy. And they were just handed over in a therapy room, and the therapist would go through that with the clients, ask for any feedback. In a digital world, when we're working remotely, that becomes a little bit more difficult. How do you send a contract to a client, and how do you get the contract back? And there are a number of ways that you can do that. You can either email the contract and get the client to just type in the signature and send it back. In terms of a more of a professional approach, there are a number of sites, there are a number of websites that allow you to send a document and it will arrive in the client's inbox. They can sign it and it automatically notarizes it's been signed and sends it back to you. And a lot of therapists are now using programs such like EverSign or DocuSign. There's quite a few. DocuHub, the one that we talk about in our course, which of course is DocuSign or Sign Now. All these are really useful, and it really helps clients because they get the contract. They can look through it at their leisure. They can sign it and send it back. But there are cases, of course, where maybe clients aren't sophisticated. They may not have use of a computer. So what do we do then? What happens if a client is, say, a phone client and doesn't have a computer and has a very basic phone? Well, I think sometimes it is just a case of maybe verbally explaining the contract and just getting the client maybe to text back and say that they've understood it. And it's an interesting one because a lot of therapists, certainly in the online world, have really come a bit unstuck with sending contracts, because it does mean that you've got to use a platform. You can email them, as I said, but it is better to use a platform. And using a platform is I think is a really helpful way of sending a document so it is legally signed, Ken.
Yeah, so when Rory's saying a platform, what he's referring to there is using a piece of software or an application, an app, some external software provider, something that you may pay for in order to sell that. It's like a bridge between you and your client. Of course, you can send by email, but that again depends on the client being able to receive the email, them having a private, confidential inbox that is not accessible by others that might find that contract. So it is an important topic. Online contracting itself, we've already delved into this. And if you're interested in kind of understanding the difference between a face-to-face contract and an online contract, you can pick up details on that in episode 164 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. That went live on the 3rd of October 2020. So go look up our podcast on counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, episode 164, more info on online contracts. But the thing about a contract, if you're face-to-face, it's easier because the person can see it. The person can give verbal acknowledgement that suits them. You may ask them to sign that and date them. You might put that on record, and you've got a record that the client understands what therapy is on offer, how the therapy works, the times that you're doing the therapy, when you might have to break confidentiality. And a contract is there and it's in place for if something should go wrong, or if something should start going off track, you would refer back to the contract. And at its worst, a contract may be called for if a disciplinary is held against you by a client. If the client makes a complaint, it is often the case that the ethical body will say, can we see the contract that you were working to? So where you can, if you are working online, it is best practice to get a client signature, because it protects the client. It means that they've read through it and they understand what is on offer. Protects you as a therapist in that you have evidence that they have read through that and signed to say they have done that. In the absence of that, as Rory has said, you can work with a verbal agreement, but it's really worth maybe getting something extra. Like, I love what Rory said, getting them to maybe text you saying, yes, I understand the contract. And in that case, in the absence of having a signed contract, make sure that you put it in your notes. So working with the client right at the beginning, I fully explained the following contract to the client, and they verbally agreed with me on such and such a date at such and such a time in such and such a session. So be really specific on that. So you can work with a verbal agreement. There is nothing in law that says it has to be signed, but just cover yourself there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Ken alluded to, it's part of becoming a professional therapist. We in face-to-face work, we would carefully choose our rooms. We would, carefully think about, our CPD and how we conducted ourselves as therapists. And our paperwork and our documentations are an extension of that. And also, it's about how you get put over to the clients. It's about generating confidence. If you're sending a professional a link to a signed document that the client can look over at their leisure and make a decision and crucially ask questions and clarify. I think that good contracting starts with the contract being given to the client and then followed up maybe in the next session just to go through it and ask if there's any questions or any things that the client doesn't understand, or even in some cases, as we've said on the podcast many times before, checking the client can read. There's a presumption that people can read. And it may be that people may be sight impaired, maybe that people, struggle reading. So you nearly need to check that. But having your documents sent with a professional document signing protocol, I think inspires confidence. And certainly if you ever have to defend your decisions in front of a hearing, makes you look more professional and gives the evidence that you've actually sent a contract.
Indeed. And I'm going to use an example here, and I'm using DocuSign. It's DocuSign. And I use this not because we recommend it or endorse any software at all. I'm just using it as an example. But with DocuSign, you're probably, as a therapist, looking at about £100 a year for membership of DocuSign to cover you for the contracts you might need for a year. And this is the thing about working online. If you're working online, there are expenses with working online in the same way as there are expenses related to a face-to-face practice. Hiring of a room, for example, might be one of those. So there are benefits to working online in that you don't have to hire a room, but maybe you need to buy the right equipment to work online, and that's an investment up front. And tools like a e-signature platform that you can use, maybe that is part of best practice for working online if you decide that that's an area that you want to really focus on. And the keyword to look up if you're looking to see what tools, just go online and put in e-signature software or e-signature app, pop that into Google, and there will be, I'm sure, plenty of search results that might come up there. Have a look around, have a look at the pricing. Very often, because they're dealing with contracts, there's a level of confidentiality and encryption in that only you and the client see that. So the seller of the software, for example, DocuSign, they don't have access to any of your documents. When you send the contract to the client, they don't have to physically sign it. They can't take a pen and sign on their screen. I know that's really obvious, but they can't. They also don't have to print it out and sign it and post it back. Although you could do that if you did it via email. That is one method you might do. If you you could even post it to a person. If you've kind of checked that with the client and they are definitely the only one that is going to be receiving that mail and they're comfortable to do so, you can send a self-stamped addressed envelope that they can send it back in. But back to the e-signature, how it works is they just type their name in. And it records that, it logs their IP address and the time that they did it, and it kind of evidences and it changes the typed name that they put in into kind of a what looks like a graphic representation of their signature, and it says to them, are you happy with this? Do you understand this? They click yes, and then it would notify you as the holder of the account and say, okay, this document has now been signed. So, I mean, e-signature platforms are used for many different things. They're used by law firms to get signatures, so they are pretty robust in nature. And I think it's just a good way of tracking what you're doing if you're working online. Rory, you mentioned, we cover this in our course, Under Contracting. We run at Counselling Tutor an online and telephone counselling training certificate course. And if you're interested in finding out more about our training course, you can go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is on the website. So there you have it. There's e-signatures and contracts online. Moving now into practice matters, where we dip our toe into what we come across in practice. Interesting one today, Rory, because you spoke and met up with Michael Pearson to speak about sex and sexuality, didn't you?
I did. Sex is an interesting topic that comes up more than one would think in the therapy room. And Michael Pearson has done a wonderful lecture for us on how to engage with discussing sex, why it's important to be thoughtful when you're working with a client, not to put sex to one side. It's part of us completely, and how we engage respectfully with it, and how we shouldn't be frightened of speaking about it openly with clients, and the different forms of sexuality. What we might believe is sex may be completely different to a client. So in this interview, Michael does outline it, and just fair warning, it contains themes of an adult nature.
Practice matters.
And it's my great pleasure to welcome Michael Pearson, and who is a lecturer of counselling. Why don't you just tell us just a little bit about your most varied roles and knowledge?
Well, where do I start? So I've worked in a variety of sectors. I've worked in the NHS. I used to work in offending institutes, charities, third sector, and I'm working in higher education now. The theme being mental health, but across that I've worked with lots of different groups, youth worker roles, higher education now, so students, adults, homelessness, so quite the variety over the past 10 years.
A real kind of breadth of knowledge and experience there. And you recently recorded a lecture for us on sex and sexuality. Let me ask you a question. Why is it important that therapists have a understanding of sex and sexuality?
Sex, it impacts so much in the therapy room with clients. I don't think it's always understood. And I think there's an assumption that we wait until the client brings up sex in the room and then we'll talk about it. But knowing that even just looking at sexual abuse rates in men and women, I think it's about 1 in 4 in women, 1 in 6 in men. And I'm not saying that has a direct link to sex, but it's likely to have an influence, and that's just sexual abuse. So if you open the whole field up and think, okay, who might have an issue around sex and how might it be impacted? It's huge. The numbers are massive. If we are not connecting to that in the therapy room and we are assuming that the client will bring sex up, we're making a mistake from the get-go.
Absolutely. So, where it's necessary, bring it into the room. and it's a part of everybody's life. I mean, hey, we all got here because of sex. So,
Exactly.
so yes, don't be afraid of it. Do you think practitioners may be nervous about talking about sex?
Oh, absolutely. I used to be, and I think it's really important we acknowledge that and we acknowledge our own judgments. But we all know about, well, hopefully we all know about projection. And I think with sex, it's that's so typical that if we are nervous about it, if we're uncomfortable, if we feel we don't know enough about it, we're going to project that. The client's going to experience that, and the client will get that message of silence means don't talk about it, and they'll hear that loud and clear.
And if there is anybody who's listening to this and thinking, do you know, I really do feel uncomfortable about talking about sex, what would be helpful for them to know or do?
I think we're pretty good at reflecting, therapists. I hope we should be, and I think that's where it's got to start. You've got to reflect on your own issues, your own judgments, and your own shame around sex. Some really nice reflective exercises around shame levels and where they start to grow if you think about sexual practice. And that's a really basic place to start. Think about things, think about fantasies, and try and engage in your own fantasies and fetishes. Do that on your own, see what comes up, see what shame levels come up, and we've got to start processing them. And we know shame is quite infectious. So if a therapist is feeling shame in the room, the client's likely to feel it, and vice versa. So we've got to work with those levels first. And then I think we need to increase our knowledge around sex. So never expect the client to educate you. They're already feeling shame most likely, and won't feel the need to educate you if they're experiencing high shame levels. So you've got to educate yourself. So if they start to hint on it, you're able to be the one that comes forward and asks the most appropriate questions, or shows you understand, show you have some knowledge about this. Instantly, the client will clock that, and they'll think, oh, okay, this therapist is, I think they're comfortable talking about this.
Absolutely. And I think an area, you know, if there's anybody listening to this is feeling uncomfortable, and maybe uncomfortable in the therapy room as a therapist engaging with sex, I think a good place to start is your own personal therapy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, personal therapy, supervision. Supervision is a really good place actually for talking about sex, because I think it will help you get over some of the discomfort and engaging in a conversation around sex in a therapeutic setting with a supportive supervisor. And I think that's definitely a different feel to what you'd get out of personal therapy. In supervision, it probably emulates that environment you'll have with a client more, I think, in a strange way, and will give you really good practice to how to have a fluid conversation about sex without feeling shame or embarrassment.
Yes, it also gives you a vocabulary, doesn't it? And one of the things that I picked up on, and bearing in mind this is a sort of family show, is that using the terminology the client may use. So, you know, if a client refers to a part of their body in a certain way, it may be that you engage using the same form of language.
Definitely. I won't say what I said in the lecture then, but know what you're comfortable with first. So that's probably another really good exercise. Go away and think about that vocabulary. Say that to yourself. Say it aloud. Say it in a mirror. Maybe say it with somebody you trust and you're close to, and obviously explain why you're saying it to them. But practice saying those words and see whether you're comfortable or not. And what I'm not asking you to do is use words you're uncomfortable with, because that's not genuine either. But practice, see where you can push your boundaries appropriately. If you cannot use those words either, I think it's really important you address that in the room, not to make it about you, but so the client understands why you are using different language. Because if they're using explicit language, which most of my clients do, and I'm happy to do that, and then I use very polite or medical terminology, there's a real juxtaposition, and that will shame the client very quickly to think, oh, I shouldn't have said that word. I shouldn't have gone there. This therapist can't go there.
Yes. It almost medicalizes the whole procedure. can damage the relationship. And also, yes, it might be that the shame is so great on behalf of the client that they're frightened of offending the therapist. Or I know I've had that in my practice where someone said they've used a word and they've said, I'm sorry about that, and I've said there's no need to apologise. That's your word for it, and here, you use the words that are comfortable for you.
Definitely, yeah. We're normalising the language, and
Yes.
we're acknowledging if we can or can't use that language. More often than not, I'll say, "Do you mind me using that word as well?" Because I think it can be a bit shocking for
Yes.
them to hear us say that. But if I'm comfortable, I'll say aloud, "Do you mind me using that word?" Because it's a word I'd use.
Yes.
It's really connecting very, very quickly, and you can almost see the physical comfort when you engage in that way.
Yes, and also we have to realise that people have different sexual preferences and engage in sex in a different way. So I think it's very useful to expand our understanding of sexual practices, quite frankly.
Yeah, definitely, and that's probably one of the second biggest things you can go out and do is understand. We try and start moving away from, and I said this quite a lot in the lecture, but try and move away from penis and vagina sex, because that is a heteronormative model, and for the majority of us, that's very normal and understandable. But if you can move away from that as a standard of sex and think, actually, sex doesn't have to involve a penis and vagina. It can involve any combination. It can involve no sexual organs. It can be spiritual. It can have different types of relationships involved in that practice. So sex can be all sorts, and that's what we need to understand and help our clients understand as well. So we're not moving to this one direction of achievement in sex, which for some people it's not possible.
Yes, and I think having a wider understanding of that, and what you did mention, which I thought was really interesting, was chemsex, where people may use substances to either enhance the sexual practices or to mask the shame of it.
Yeah, and it's important we don't judge either way what that is, and help the client to understand why they're doing it, if that's where they want to lead the direction of the conversation. Often in conversations around sex, and this is quite well evidenced, therapists will very quickly assume something is damaging for a client and therefore try and fix it. That happens a lot with chemsex. There's an assumption this is bad, this is wrong, it's because there's trauma. It could be, it might not be. They might just enjoy it, and they might practice it very safely. We can work with a client in terms of harm reduction and harm reduction practices, and that's a positive way to go. But don't make the assumption it's wrong. Find out information, and then we can work with them to what might be better.
Yes, and it all comes down to not being judgmental. And allowing people to be themselves and explore that side of them. It's a huge side sexuality of humans. It's one that really is we still live in quite restrictive times, don't we? I think in terms of societal acceptance.
Yeah, we do. We're coming out of a big cycle, I think, where we went through a period in history where we were quite sexually liberated and then entered a stage. I think it was the Victorian era where really a lot of that sexual oppression started, and we're still coming out of that. And you tend to see these cycles. But yes, we can't judge it. And shame is a huge part of that. Shame will stunt creativity. And I'm talking about sex, sexual creativity. It will stunt all that shaming, and society tends to shame a lot around sexual practice that's alternative, which the majority of people, huge amounts of people, there's some surveys and research to suggest about 60% of people engage in some kind of kink or BDSM practice. So whilst society is shaming it, actually the majority of us do it.
Yes, it is a very interesting area, one that needs to be uncovered. You don't mind me mixing the metaphor there, and one that shows itself in the therapy room. It was a really great lecture. It's one not to be missed, and I think if you are a practitioner, it's an area that you need to develop. So Michael Pearson, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Been a pleasure.
Big thank you to Michael Pearson and to you, Rory, for hosting that interview. And of course, if you enjoyed what Michael was talking about, Michael has done a complete lecture on this topic, sex and sexuality, and that is available in our Continuing Professional Development Library, our CPD library. And basically, the CPD library is jam-packed full of quality lectures from leaders in the field, and it is there so that we as counsellors, as psychotherapists, can engage in that and basically sharpen our competence, better serve our clients. That's the reason we built the CPD library. And if you are interested in getting more info on the CPD library, you can do so from our main website, which is counsellingtutor.com. It is either a very low monthly cost or a really affordable annual cost to give you unlimited access to basically hundreds of hours of lectures. So there it is, Rory. That was episode 173.
Yeah, what a great episode, if I do say so myself, and I am. We started off with a newer development in person-centered therapy, configurations of self. I think any students who's studying counselling and certainly person-centered therapy should have a look at that. It's such a really big development in the meta model. We went on to talk about sending and receiving contracts, how to do that safely and securely, and then finally we caught up with Michael Pearson, who gave us a really insightful interview regarding sex and sexuality. And as always, stay grounded, stay safe, and join the Digital Counselling Revolution.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counselor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counselor CPD Library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.